Hello, and welcome to the Crypto Delicious channel. This is the first video of hopefully many videos where I will spread some information about Bitcoin and other crypto technology, crypto related musings. So hence the title here, Bitcoin Musings #1. And to start off with, I thought it would be good just to talk about what is Bitcoin. Is it a Ponzi? You hear that all the time, don't you? People say, oh, it's just a Ponzi. Like, there's so many critics that say that. So we'll try and address that and a couple other things, and we'll try and do that in 10 minutes or not much longer than 10 minutes. My hope is that I can make a series of videos where the information is concise, easy to understand, and hopefully answer questions that a lot of people have when they first start looking into Bitcoin or other types of crypto. So yeah, let's start. Get right into it. Ponzi. So you hear that all the time. People say Bitcoin is a Ponzi, and I've seen so many videos on YouTube where people say, oh, it's a Ponzi, and this is why it's a Ponzi. And after a while, you can see that they actually don't really know what Bitcoin is. They don't know the basic fundamentals of how Bitcoin is set up. And if they did, they would realize that their arguments don't make any sense. So I was thinking, let's take it from another approach and just say, what exactly is a Ponzi? Because people throw that word around a lot, but not everyone is clear on what a Ponzi means. So just bear with me for a second, for those of you that do. But a definition here is that a Ponzi runs on indefinitely. So in other words, as long as possible, using money from the newest investors into this Ponzi scheme to pay back the returns for the oldest investors in the scheme. So the new money is paying the interest or dividends or whatever to the oldest investors. So the original investors think everything is great. But of course, after a while, you run out of enough people, new people, to pay the old people. So it gradually loses more and more money because the person that set it up, they're either intentionally stealing or they're incompetent. And the whole thing just blows up in the end, because eventually it just collapses under the weight of the size that it's grown to. People can't, the person that set up the Ponzi scheme, they're not able to pay back everybody, and everyone starts realizing that, this isn't working and the gig is up, right? It just all blows up. Now, this happens because it's centralized. You have one or two or three people, or a group of people that set up this Ponzi scheme, and they're controlling everything. It's some kind of closed, obscure structure. It's impossible or extremely difficult to audit exactly what's going on. So of course, the prime example of this is Bernie Madoff, right? Everyone, when you hear the name Bernie Madoff, you think of this guy that stole millions of dollars. I don't know how many millions, but huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions, and he's in prison. But another good example, which is a simpler, much smaller scale example, is Jan Levin, the Polka King. You're probably wondering, who is this guy? And if you have Netflix, I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but if possible, if you can find this movie, it's excellent. You see Jack Black there, starring in this movie, the Polka King. Now, of course, Jack Black is not Jan Levin, but Jan Levin is a real person. Like, this stuff really happened. And it's a hilarious movie, but the sad thing is it's all true as well, about how this guy, who he wanted to be a Polka King, he started taking all these people money. He actually probably did intend to pay them back, but he just couldn't. It just all fell apart. So he went to jail. He still swears he's going to pay everyone back, but it's just not going to happen. But that's a great movie to see, to kind of understand how these Ponzi schemes can so easily happen. Now, we're talking about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not a Ponzi because it's open to scrutiny. It's a clearly defined limited supply. It's decentralized, so it's the opposite of centralized, and it can be mathematically proven. So we're going to talk more about these points as we go on, but just talking about the second bullet point, the limited supply, there can only be 21 million. So 21 million Bitcoin ever. And some of them have been lost for one reason or another. So there's actually less than 21 million. But let's just say there's 21 million. It's totally limited. There's never going to be more than 21 million Bitcoin. It's just mathematically impossible. Okay, so what is it? If it's not a Ponzi, then what is Bitcoin? Now, you could spend hours just trying to answer this question. And for someone that's new to the space, it would just confuse you. So I'm going to just try and have a few bullet points that will explain what it is. It's a hard asset, meaning it's a store of value, like let's say gold. Gold is a hard asset, but Bitcoin is even harder. And the way to understand that perhaps is that you can still mine more gold. Like there's still more gold in the earth. There's still gold in other places, even in outer space, right? So gold, the supply of gold is always growing, but it is limited. I mean, it's not easy to get gold, right? It's not easy to mine for gold. So that's what makes it a hard asset. But Bitcoin is even harder, because once we get to the limit of the Bitcoins, that's it. There's not going to be any more. It's impossible to mine anymore. Cannot be duplicated. There's no way to print more of it. So let's say someone gives you some Bitcoin and you say, okay, this is good, I'm going to copy it. Well, actually you can't. And probably beyond the scope of this initial video to explain why, but mathematically you just can't do that. Each Bitcoin is made up of 100 million Satoshis. So the reason I mention this is sometimes when someone's new to understanding what Bitcoin is, and you hear the number 21 million, then you might think, well, 21 million, well, that's, there's like over 7 billion people on Earth. So how's that going to work? Well, the thing is, you don't have to have or purchase or spend a whole Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually a unit which can be divided into 100 million parts. Each one of those parts is a Satoshi. So when you're Googling around and looking into Bitcoin, you might hear people talk about sats, S-A-T-S in brackets. That's short for Satoshis. So just a little explanation there. So you might be here looking into what Bitcoin is because you've heard a lot about it, and people say it's the next greatest thing. It's going to be worth $1 million in a couple of years, or 300 million. And you hear all these outlandish numbers, and you naturally wonder, okay, is this how you can get rich? Well, no. That's not the point. At least that's not the point of this video. I mean, it is something that's an investment. Of course, people are investing it because they hope it's going to go up in value, and it very well may. But it's not something which is a guaranteed slam dunk. It's a new type of asset. It's not necessarily going to go up in a straight line. It's actually going to go up and down along the way quite a bit. So yeah, this is not a get rich quick type of thing, but it is very interesting. However, people wonder, or at least another criticism that you hear is only criminals use it, right? So yeah, I've heard about this Bitcoin thing, but I think that's just for criminals. Well, let's look at it another way. Do criminals use regular money? So the cash that you have in your wallet, do criminals use that? Well, absolutely. Do you use regular money? Yes. Are you a criminal? Probably not. And that's the good thing. Most people are not criminals, right? It's fortunately a small segment of society. But they use regular money and we use regular money. Does that make money in itself wrong? No, absolutely not. So this always reminds me of the question of the internet and the fear of the unknown. So do you remember, think back to when you first heard about the internet, the first time someone told you about the internet? Do you remember what people said back then? So, I mean, I'm dating myself, but I was around when the internet was not created. Okay, that was in the 60s, but when it became a household name, I was around. I remember I was using it back then myself. I happened to be working in the software industry and had access to that. So when I would talk about it to friends and family, you just see that sort of glazed look in people's eyes. And then when it first started being mentioned in the media, it was always something kind of sensationalized about how the internet was used in some kind of nefarious way. So that's the impression people had. And you mentioned the internet, and people would say, "Oh, that's like for criminals, isn't it?" Which sounds hilarious now, right? But back then, that was the impression. And now, when you think about the internet, everybody uses the internet, right? Well, today, Bitcoin is actually getting to that point where obviously it's not used by the masses quite yet, but it is literally used by millions of regular people. Especially when you think of some lands where the currency is under a lot of pressure. You think of places like Venezuela, other countries where the currency is being devalued. People are actually using Bitcoin as a store of value which is more stable than the currency that they have locally. So they can transfer it securely without third-party risk. We can explain more about that later. But it is being used by literally millions of people today, and not just criminals. So then, okay, let's say you're with me this far, and the next question might be, all right, well, how's it going to affect my life? Because, all right, this Bitcoin thing exists, people can use it, but how does it affect me personally? Because as far as I can see, it's just geek money. Well, thinking back again to this internet thing back in the 90s, let me ask you a question. Did you use it in 1994? Probably not. I'm even guessing a lot of people listening to this maybe weren't even old enough or even born in 1994 to use the internet. But do you use the internet now? Absolutely. Definitely. You're using it to watch this video, right? So how many years is that? 26 years? Right? It's how quickly things change, right? In fact, from between 1994 and 2004, the growth of the internet was just huge, wasn't it? Right? Now, when you think about Bitcoin and relate that to Bitcoin, Bitcoin is the internet of money. I'll say that one more time. Bitcoin is the internet of money. And again, that could be a whole other video, but I'm not going to try and do that because there's many people much more capable than myself that have already done that. And actually, there's a series of books with that title, The Internet of Money. So Andreas Antonopoulos, he's a speaker, an author, very knowledgeable. He's been doing this for years. Please check him out. That's his Twitter handle, @Antonop, and his website, aantonop.com. Definitely encourage you to check it out. So much information there. And he can explain it in a way that's probably very easy to understand and, definitely more clearly than myself. Okay, so, all right. So let's say it's not just for geeks and it's going to be something that everybody uses. Then how about actually using it? Because I'm not that good at computers, and I hear you have to be really good at computer stuff. Well, you have to be somewhat knowledgeable, but you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be good at technology. People think about that, when they hear about Bitcoin, and they automatically get worried because they hear all these horror stories about people getting hacked, how the Bitcoin gets stolen. And if you invest in Bitcoin, then you know that you're going to end up being one of those people that gets hacked and get your Bitcoin stolen, and you're going to be homeless, your family's not going to love you anymore, people are going to laugh at you, all these horror stories, right? Well, it doesn't have to be that way. But in order to successfully use it, you do have to educate yourself, and you have to be your own bank. And hence the expression, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So yeah, you don't have to know computer stuff, but you do have to do some education for sure. So that expression, not your keys, not your Bitcoin, what is it? What are these keys? Why do we need keys? Well, Bitcoin funds are locked and unusable without keys. Okay, so that's a fundamental point. The Bitcoin funds, you can't use them without keys. So the public key, this is kind of a crude explanation. I'm going to refine this later on in this presentation. But just bear with me for a second here. So the public key is the one that's public. It's the one you would give out. The private key is the one you do not. Okay, the private key must remain private. So both keys are needed in order to effectively use Bitcoin on the blockchain, this public ledger that everyone has access to, or that people can see. Anyone can view the public ledger, by the way. But only the person with the private key can access the Bitcoin associated with that private key, right? So if you don't have the keys, it's not your Bitcoin. So the reason this is so important is sometimes people will say, oh, give me $1,000 and I'll give you X amount of Bitcoin. And just trust me, I've got your Bitcoin. Anytime you need your Bitcoin, you just talk to me and I'll make sure you got your Bitcoin. You do not want to do it that way. There's just been so many horror stories about that, scams and exchanges that have collapsed, that have gotten hacked, right? All of that is avoided if you manage it yourself. You are the person that has the private key. You are the person that controls the Bitcoin that you own. So hence the next expression, the next phrase, be your own bank. So what I just said, maybe it sounds too complicated, right? I mean, all of this stuff about having to set up your own private key and making sure that you have it and you don't lose it and no one else gets it, it sounds like it's difficult. But with a little bit of time studying it and just watching some more videos, getting up to speed on it, it's actually not that difficult. But the key is to understand a few of the basic concepts, because if you understand these concepts, then it's going to make it a lot more easier to understand. So here, what I'm trying to show here is that there's an example of a private key. So the private key is sort of where this all starts. And the private key is basically just a random number. I'll probably make another whole video about how that all works, but you can just bear with me for a second here. A private key is, all it is a random number. But once you have this private key, then you can have the public key. The public key is created based on the private key. So the mathematics behind all of this is complicated, but you don't have to actually understand that yourself in order to use Bitcoin. All you have to know is you have a private key and there's a public key associated with that, and the private key cannot be reversed. When I say reversed, I mean reverse engineered. So what I mean by that is, when you have the public key here, if you give that out to someone, there's no way for them to look at that and take it back a step to calculate what your private key is. Because if they could, then they would have your Bitcoin. But it's actually impossible for them to do that. Let's talk a little bit more about that. But I have this bolded in here as confidence point number 1, because this is kind of the first step to trusting how Bitcoin works. If you don't understand this, you're not going to trust Bitcoin. You're going to listen to those people that say it's a Ponzi, and you might just believe that it's a Ponzi, and it's just, you don't want to touch it. But confidence point number 1, private key cannot be reverse engineered. Okay, so how does that work? Because you might be thinking, if, just from a mathematical point of view, if knowing A means I know B, then I can reverse that operation, and knowing B means I can know A. And the answer is actually no, at least not easily. And in fact, it's with so much difficulty, it's impossible. And when I say impossible, it's practically impossible, People say that there's these quantum computers that are out there buried in the basement of IBM or whatever, someplace, and they actually have these early versions of quantum computers that can calculate and reverse engineer the public key and find out what the private key is. No, that's not true. And the reason is, this is based on elliptic curve cryptography. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not someone that could explain all the ins and outs of this, but I do know that you can make a very crude comparison of how this concept works. So imagine you have two prime, this is just high school math, okay? So don't worry, I'm not gonna, just bear with me, and I'm sure that you can follow this. So you have two prime numbers, 5 and 7, right? And for those that may not remember, a prime number is a number that can only be divided by itself and the number 1, okay? So the first few prime numbers are like 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, and it keeps going from there. So let's say you have two prime numbers, 5 and 7. The product of those is 35. So if I asked you to tell me what are the prime numbers that you multiply together to make up 35, then that's pretty easy, right? You can say 35, well, that's just 5 times 7, like that. So I know the factors that are prime numbers of the number 35 is 5 and 7. Okay, now you did that in your head very quickly, right? But how about this number? 8 quadrillion, 980 trillion, 935 billion, 516 million, 546,571. Okay, this huge number, huge for us, like huge for the human brain, but obviously not huge for a computer, but just, we're doing this exercise just in relation to the way the human brain works, okay? So you have this huge number. What two prime numbers are the factors of this number? And in fact are the only factors of this number. If I gave you a sheet of paper and a pencil, you might be able to figure it out. In fact, it would probably take a long, long time. Like, this is without a calculator, by the way, right? If I just gave you a sheet of paper and pencil and asked you to figure this out just by hand, then maybe after a few months you'd come up with the answer. But I doubt it. But the answer is actually 86,028,157 and 104,395,303. These are two prime numbers, and they're the only factors of this huge number, right? So the whole point to this is, you have a value, right? It's really easy to multiply these two together. Like, you could do that by hand. If I gave you a sheet of paper and just asked you to multiply this 86 million number by the 104 million number, you could probably do that pretty quickly. But if I just gave you the product and asked you to tell me what are the two factors, the prime numbers that make up this number, that's a lot more difficult, right? And basically, that's the concept in a very crude comparative way of elliptic curve cryptography. Except elliptic curve cryptography is much, much, much more difficult. And we're talking like astronomical numbers and beyond the scope of this conversation, but basically the whole point to this is you cannot reverse engineer it. As difficult it is for the human brain to figure out the factors that make up this huge number, it's actually exponentially more difficult for a computer to reverse engineer the public key back into a private key. So, okay, enough of that for now. So let's talk about the next step. So you have a public key, but this public key is different from the Bitcoin address. The Bitcoin address is the base 58 representation of the public key, which makes it a little bit shorter, right? So you have uppercase and lowercase letters, and it starts with a number 1 or a number 3, There's actually another type of notation as well, but basically you have this base 58 Bitcoin address, which represents the public key. So just wanted to mention this so that you're introduced to the concept that the Bitcoin address is actually a little bit different from the public key. So by the way, all of this information I'm spewing out, don't be surprised if you are feeling a little bit lost, you don't understand everything. This is just kind of a way to introduce everything. And hopefully at the end of this, you can have the sense that this is something very structured. It is something that can be explained in great detail and is not a Ponzi. All right, that's the whole point of this. Okay, so we were talking about keys before, and you might have heard of the expression of a wallet. Yeah, people say, okay, I've got some Bitcoin and I've got to get a Bitcoin wallet so I can put the Bitcoin into the wallet. So how does this wallet work? Well, the wallet's actually an unfortunate name because when we think of a wallet, we think of cash that we put into the wallet, right? And Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, they don't really work that way. There's a blockchain on which the Bitcoin lives on. So the Bitcoin never leaves the blockchain, this public ledger. The Bitcoin that you own always stays on the blockchain. But what you do have is the key in order to unlock that Bitcoin, which is on the blockchain. So when we talk about a Bitcoin wallet, what we're talking about is something that securely holds the private key you need to unlock the Bitcoin that you own on the blockchain. So that's the basic answer there about what a wallet is. It's just something that holds the key or keys to your Bitcoin on the blockchain. And there's different kinds of wallets. You can have a paper wallet, a desktop wallet. You hear about hot wallets, cold wallets, mobile wallets, hardware wallets. There's quite a bit just to the topic of wallets. And so of course, that's something that we could spend a whole separate presentation on. So we're probably going to wrap it up here. So let's just summarize. And hopefully this has shed some light on some things you weren't clear on, or maybe it's answered some questions. It's probably raised a whole bunch of new questions, but that's good. So just a quick summary of this video. Not a Ponzi. And please see that Jack Black movie. It was really good. It's a hard asset. It's scarce, limited supply, used by millions of people. Like literally millions of people are using Bitcoin now. You don't have to know computer stuff, but you do need to educate yourself. Cryptography makes it possible, and wallets hold the keys, not the Bitcoin. So yeah, from here, what next? Well, there's lots of excellent resources out there, books, videos, blogs. Please follow me. My handle on Twitter is CryptoDelicious. Lots of great YouTubers are pumping out content on what Bitcoin is, the benefits of it, how you can understand it some more. So please just keep searching, keep looking for more information. And thanks for your time. Okay, later.